Now, according to PwC's EMEA Private Business Attractiveness Index, South Africa has climbed to the 23rd position out of 33 countries, marking an improvement from its ranking in 2021 and 2022, thus becoming a more attractive location for private business. PwC Africa Private Leader Duncan Adriaans attributes this positive shift to South Africa's economic reconstruction and recovery plan. However, while South Africa ascends in the index is notable, the report also considers persistent challenges in SA that make strategic financial management and resilience crucial for sustained growth. Joining us to unpack this report in greater detail is Duncan Adriaans, who's private leader at PwC Africa. Duncan, thank you for your time and good afternoon.
Good afternoon to you, Nolotando, and thank you for having me on your show today.
All right, sounds like it's good news. Duncan, help us to put this into context.
No, thank you so much. So it's definitely good news, but how one's unpacked it is perhaps just important. I think the first key point I want to make is it is a relative index, so it's always going to be in relation to other jurisdictions. So we're looking at Europe, Middle East, and Africa on this particular index. And the reason for our improvement is perhaps a function of two things. One, we have seen some marginal improvement in some areas. Perhaps some of those relate to a regulatory reform. We've seen more efforts around, for example, renewable energy coming on board. So some of those things move us forward. But because it's relative to other jurisdictions have also fared or regressed, if one were to put it that way, a little bit. So relative to others, we have moved forward. But, typical as South Africans, we're very critical of our own situation. So there's still room for improvement. But relative to others, we have moved at a slightly better pace compared to some of the others as well.
So coming in at 23, maybe let's look at that relativity. How did we rank compared to some of our emerging market peers?
So compared to some of our emerging markets, we seem to be doing better. So on the African continent, within this particular index, we have Kenya and Nigeria. And I think in those particular regards, they sort of very much in the infancy stages of this particular index. We've moved just about into the emerging index, which is 40 points and above, and we score 40.7. So we're at the front line in relation to the rest of the continent. But there are some aspects, for example, where we perform really well, and I think we sort of top in the index. So, for example, is the one around cell phone access. The amount of individuals in South Africa who have access to mobile devices, I think really outweigh those compared to our colleagues in the EMEA index. And I was listening to the advertisement prior to this interview about the digital economy. There's a huge opportunity for the digital economy to thrive and also for private businesses to think about what are the channels with which I can communicate with my customers? How do I talk to them? How do I engage with them? And to make sure that I stay relevant in the very competitive environment that they find themselves in.
I must also ask you, Duncan, of course, like you're saying, as South Africans, overly critical of ourselves. We know of all our infrastructure issues. We know there's all this red tape. And so, from an attractiveness perspective, where are we faring here, just compared to others that are measured according to the index?
So yeah, we are fairly critical on ourselves. There are areas that require lots of improvement, So if you look at the macroeconomics, we don't fare very great. The IMF last week having reduced their growth forecast for South Africa is sort of really not great for private businesses. I think the infrastructure problems that you've alluded to at the ports, the networks and the railways, those are really frustrating some of the private businesses. If I hop onto load shedding, those have been really also hampering the level of productivity that our economy so much needs and so much for our private businesses. Private businesses don't necessarily have those large balance sheets. Those little shocks or crises can really either take them out of business 1 year and be completely sort of liquidated. And so it's our resilience to some of these shocks that are going to be very important for private businesses. But also on a more positive note, Nolotando, we've seen that more often than not, when we have certain challenges in our country, we've also seen private businesses saying, well, here's also an opportunity. I'm not going to let me hold me back. I'm going to muck along back up and find a solution to make sure that we go that. So I do believe in the resilience of South African entrepreneurs. We do also see the opportunity. We also see the gaps to create that for ourselves as well.
What is encouraging is how we've ranked here in terms of social responsibility and governance. I think it does speak to a caring and accountable society, but help us understand what that means.
Yeah, so I was equally surprised when the result came out, and I also wanted to understand what that means. But I think you're spot on. So we do look at diversity in terms of diversity, equity, and sort of the inclusion. So one of the things that gets us very high on the index is things such as the number of women and how we progress the advancement of women in parliament. So if I'm not mistaken, we're on top of the rank in all countries. We have the most number of women, female representation in parliament. The amount of press freedom has also given us some good scores. Our country has not seen any major restrictions on clamping down on sort of news networks or in social media in terms of access. So those are the kinds of things that are happening. In that same level of indicators are things such as trust in government. That's an area where we need to continue to work on. We have elections around the corner, and I think the trust in government will probably be indicator, which parties come forward. So I think there are a couple of aspects within social governance that we do look at. We also look at gender pay gaps. So we're not scoring very well in terms of whether the gender pay gap needs to be closed in terms of males dominating the pay remuneration agenda in relation to females as well.
Well, it's all we have time for today, Duncan. Very, very fascinating insights. Thank you so much for taking us through this. Very encouraging indeed. Thank you. That was PwC's private leader, Duncan Adriaans.